Welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're going to be taking a close look at Karen Horney's The Neurotic Personality of Our Time. It's a fascinating exploration of how anxieties and defenses play out in our lives. Really trying to see what Horney's ideas can teach us about ourselves.
It's a great book, really insightful, even decades later.
Oh, absolutely.
She delves into this idea of neurosis, but it's not just like, a little quirky, right? It's really about experiencing a level of suffering that's beyond just, the typical ups and downs that we all have.
So not just everyday stress, more like something deeper.
Yeah, exactly. Horney makes this argument that neurotic individuals struggle in a way that actually keeps them from thriving, even if, they look successful or happy on the surface.
It's not always obvious.
What's so fascinating is that the suffering is often hidden even from the neurotic person themselves.
Oh, wow.
They build up these elaborate defenses that kind of mask the underlying pain.
So where do we even begin to unpack that? Where does anxiety fit into all of this?
Well, a key distinction that Horney makes is between fear and anxiety.
Yeah.
So fear, that's a natural response to, a real threat, right? A tangible threat. Like if you're walking down a dark alley and you hear footsteps behind you, that's fear. It makes sense.
Yeah, fight or flight.
Exactly. And it's a healthy response that's designed to keep you safe, but anxiety is different.
So anxiety is more complicated.
Anxiety is a response to a perceived threat.
Okay.
And that threat might not even be real. It's really rooted in your own experience, your subjective experience of the world.
Oh, so you can't just tell someone who's anxious to just chill out.
You can try,
Uh-huh.
but it's not going to be very effective because you're not getting at the core issue,
Okay.
which is their own perception of the situation.
Their own perception.
And it's really interesting because most people, I think, underestimate how much anxiety actually shapes their lives. Even those who claim to be anxiety-free, they probably engage in certain behaviors that are driven by anxiety.
I was just thinking about that, certain habits, like checking your email a million times a day.
Yeah.
It's probably fueled by anxiety, at least a little bit. So if we all have some level of anxiety, how do we deal with it? Doesn't Horney talk about some tactics people use to try and escape their anxieties?
Yes. She outlines 4 main ones, and I bet you've used at least one of them yourself.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's hear it.
The first one is rationalizing.
Okay.
So this is where we try to turn our anxiety into some kind of logical fear. So for example, a parent who's super overprotective of their child might insist that every single playground is like a death trap.
But wouldn't they say they're just, being a good parent?
Exactly. They're rationalizing their anxiety. Right. Making it seem like a totally justified response.
To a real threat.
To a real danger, even if it's blown way out of proportion.
Yeah.
Then you've got denial, just straight up blocking anxiety from your conscious awareness.
So someone might be experiencing a racing heart, sweaty palms, all the physical symptoms would just brush it off.
Exactly. They might blame it on too much coffee or just a really stressful day without really acknowledging that anxiety.
Okay, I get that. What else?
Another super common tactic, narcotizing.
Okay.
And this is where we try to just numb the anxiety,
Yeah.
right? Using external things. So that could be work, social activities, shopping, or even, substance.
I know a few people who fit that description, always busy, always got to be doing something, never stopping to really feel what they're feeling.
Yeah. It's a way of just avoiding that discomfort, but it doesn't actually solve the problem.
Address the root cause.
And then, of course, the one we all know, avoidance. This takes so many forms, from procrastinating to just pretending certain problems don't exist.
Oh, so when I suddenly get the urge to reorganize my sock drawer when I'm supposed to be working on a big presentation.
That's definitely a possibility. We all have our own little ways of avoiding things that make us anxious.
Absolutely.
But the thing is, even though these tactics, they can offer some relief in the moment,
Right.
they prevent us from dealing with the deeper issue. And Horney says that if you're constantly avoiding your anxiety, it can actually make it worse over time.
So it's a temporary fix.
That makes sense, right? If you keep running, you're never going to actually face it.
Right. But doesn't Horney take it a step further?
She does.
She links anxiety to something kind of surprising.
Yeah.
Hostility, right?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. Horney suggests that repressed hostility is a major driver of neurotic anxiety.
Okay.
Now, she doesn't mean you want to physically harm someone. It's more about having these aggressive impulses
Oh, okay.
that we can't even admit to ourselves.
Okay, now I need an example.
Okay. Let's go back to that fear analogy, right? Imagine you're hiking with your partner, right? You love them, but you're also feeling super jealous.
Okay, yeah.
And suddenly you have this thought, just like a fleeting thought, to push them off the cliff. It's terrifying.
That's an intense thought. But I guess, things like that do pop up when you're feeling really jealous.
Yeah.
So where does the anxiety come in?
The anxiety comes from the fact that you can't admit to this hostile impulse.
Mhm.
You're horrified by your own thoughts.
Right.
But you can't process them, so they get, buried, and then they fuel that anxiety.
So the repressing makes it worse.
It creates this vicious cycle. You repress the hostility, and then that leads to feeling defenseless, right?
Yeah.
And then the world feels scarier.
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm starting to see how it all connects. So this feeling of being trapped, feeling helpless, and even hostile towards the world, is that what Horney calls basic anxiety?
Yes, exactly. And everybody experiences basic anxiety to some degree. It's part of being human, right?
Right.
But for neurotics, it's so much more intense. And it shapes, their whole worldview, how they see the world and how they behave in it.
So how do they cope with this intensity? They don't just, crumble, do they?
They don't. Horney identified 4 main strategies that neurotics develop to deal with this basic anxiety:
Okay.
seeking affection, submissiveness, striving for power, and withdrawal.
Okay, so let's break those down. What does seeking affection look like in practice?
So think of someone who constantly needs reassurance, always seeking approval, really trying to please everyone around them.
The classic people pleaser.
Exactly.
Okay, so submissiveness, that's kind of similar.
Yeah. Yeah, in a way. So submissive individuals try to avoid conflict at all costs.
Makes sense.
They really go along with whatever others want, hoping to keep things calm and just, not trigger those anxieties.
Okay, so less conflict equals less anxiety, at least in their mind.
At least in their mind. Then we have the power strategy.
Okay.
So these are the people who are driven by a need for control. They might be super ambitious, competitive, always seeking recognition, and maybe even trying to mask their underlying feelings of helplessness.
So someone who's constantly trying to climb the ladder, always striving for more, could that be driven by anxiety?
It's a definite possibility. They're trying to compensate for those inner feelings of insecurity.
Okay.
And finally, withdrawal, which is basically retreating from the world, to avoid that potential pain and rejection.
Yeah, that makes sense. So instead of engaging and risking getting hurt, they just shut down and isolate themselves.
Exactly. They might create a fantasy world in their head or just, throw themselves into work, maybe even completely avoid any kind of social situation.
Wow, this is giving me a lot to think about. And I love how Horney, she brings it all back to that central concept of basic anxiety. It's like peeling back the layers.
Yeah, right. She's brilliant, isn't she?
Yeah.
And what's even more fascinating is that these strategies often clash.
Oh, yeah.
Creating these inner conflicts. And guess what?
More anxiety.
More anxiety.
Oh, great.
Right. So someone might really crave affection,
Okay.
but also be terrified of vulnerability.
Makes sense.
Right.
So that's going to create some issues in their relationships.
Big time. Or someone might be striving for all this power and control, but then secretly be afraid of success.
Because success brings scrutiny.
Because it could open them up to criticism, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's like this tangled web of needs and anxieties.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
I'm getting a whole new perspective on human behavior. But, before we get too far ahead, I think we should go back to those neurotic needs and compulsions that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Let's dive into those a little deeper.
All right, I'm ready. All right, so we've talked about basic anxiety and those strategies, that neurotics use to kind of cope with it.
Right.
But what about those neurotic needs and compulsions? What are we really talking about there?
Well, think about the things we all want: love, success, a sense of control. I mean, for most people, these are, pretty normal desires, right? But for neurotics, these desires can get, distorted, magnified by their anxieties.
So it's not just wanting these things, it's the intensity and maybe the reason behind it, it's driven by something deeper.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where those neurotic needs really come in.
Okay.
So let's take the craving for affection, for instance.
Okay.
On the surface, it seems totally normal, right? We all want to be loved.
Of course.
We want to feel accepted. But for a neurotic person, this craving can become all-consuming.
I can imagine that. Someone who needs constant reassurance,
Mm.
always fishing for compliments, maybe even sabotaging relationships because they just can't believe someone could actually love them.
That's such a good example. There's this deep-seated belief that they're just, fundamentally unlovable.
Wow.
So it makes it hard to accept affection, even when it's given freely.
It's like they're almost allergic to love.
It really
Because
is.
it challenges, like, their whole belief system.
And then you've got the fear of vulnerability. Letting someone in means risking getting hurt.
That's scary.
And for someone with a lot of basic anxiety, that can be terrifying.
Right. So it's like this paradox, right? Desperately wanting love, but also being terrified of it.
Totally. And then you have the craving for power, for control.
Yeah.
Another really common neurotic need. And this one can manifest in so many ways. Ambition, a need for prestige, even like a drive to accumulate possessions.
So the question is it really about passion? Or is it about trying to fill some kind of void?
That's the key question, yeah. It often comes from this feeling of helplessness, deep down. So by striving for power, they're trying to compensate.
And prove something, maybe. To themselves or to the world.
Like, see, I'm not helpless, I matter.
Good.
But here's the catch.
What's up?
This need for power and control, it can backfire.
In what way?
Well, they might self-sabotage, or fear success, or just be unable to really enjoy what they've accomplished.
Because they're always on to the next thing.
Always chasing the next goal, running on a treadmill, and never arriving.
That's a good analogy.
And that brings us to another observation that Horney made.
Okay.
She noticed that neurotics often, they suffer more than they need to, even like exaggerate their misery.
Wait, so they're not just suffering, they're kind of like leaning into it. Why would anyone do that?
It's not always conscious,
Right.
but suffering can serve some, let's say, unconscious functions.
Oh, okay.
It can be a way to get sympathy, or even to punish yourself.
So, like, someone who's constantly complaining about their problems, could that be a way of, like, manipulating others?
It's a possibility. Like they're saying, look what you've done to me.
That's pretty manipulative.
It can be, but again, often it's happening on an unconscious level. It's not like they're setting out to be manipulative. They're driven by those deeper needs and anxieties.
Wow. It's crazy to think about how much is happening beneath the surface.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see Horney, like, as this psychological detective, uncovering all these hidden patterns.
I know, right? It's fascinating.
But it's not just about, like, individual psychology, is it? Horney also talks about culture, right?
Oh, absolutely. Horney really felt that Freud's theories, while brilliant, they were just too focused on these, universal drives.
Yeah.
She felt that he overlooked the impact of culture.
So where Freud saw the Oedipus complex, Horney saw society.
Exactly. And it makes total sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
Our culture shapes our values, our beliefs, even our expectations.
So, like, someone growing up in a super competitive, individualistic society, are they more likely to, develop certain needs, like the need for power and control, than someone raised in a more, like, communal society?
Absolutely. And remember, she was writing, 80 years ago. Imagine how her ideas apply now.
Oh, wow.
With social media and, the constant pressure to achieve. It's almost like a breeding ground for anxiety.
Okay, before we spiral, I want to bring this back to the listener for a second. I'm finding all of this really insightful, and I'm definitely seeing some of these, neurotic tendencies in myself, but it's not about self-judgment.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's about self-awareness. It's about understanding those forces that are driving our behavior.
So, like, approach it with curiosity and compassion.
Exactly.
And maybe even use that knowledge to make more conscious choices.
That's the goal, to live more fulfilling lives, But before we wrap up, there's one more important point that Horney makes that I want to highlight.
Yeah, listen.
Yeah.
So you're about to tell us one more important point that Horney makes. What is it?
Well, she reminds us that the line between, neurotic and normal, it's not always black and white.
Okay.
We all experience anxiety, right? In our conflicts, it's part of being human.
So we don't need to panic if we see some of these tendencies in ourselves.
Not at all. It's not about labels or shame or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's about understanding what shapes us,
So someone might be, like, a little controlling, but still have healthy relationships.
Right, exactly. While someone else might be so driven by power that they end up pushing everyone away.
It's about degrees.
It is. And, acknowledging those patterns in ourselves, that's actually a sign of strength.
Oh, interesting.
Because it means we're willing to look inward, understand what's going on.
So instead of judging, we can see these tendencies as opportunities for growth.
Absolutely. The more we understand our anxieties, the better we can navigate life's complexities and find that sense of well-being.
Once you see the pattern, you can start to break free.
Yeah, I like that. That's what makes Horney's work so powerful, It gives us that framework to understand ourselves and the world.
A map for our minds.
Speaking of maps, I have a final thought.
Okay, I'm ready.
So, Horney wrote this book over 80 years ago.
Right.
What do you think? How do her ideas apply today?
Oh, that's a good question.
I mean, with social media, the pressure to achieve, all the anxieties of, a globalized society, it makes you wonder if our modern world is even more, conducive to neurosis than back then.
Yeah, I think so. It's a lot to consider.
Definitely.
Well, that's our deep dive into the brilliant mind of Karen Horney.
She's amazing.
If you're feeling inspired, I highly recommend checking out her book, The Neurotic Personality of Our Time.
Yeah, it's so good.
It's a journey of self-discovery, and you won't regret it.
And remember, recognizing those tendencies, it's not about judging yourself.
Right.
It's about understanding. And the more we know ourselves, the more freedom we have to create those really authentic, fulfilling lives.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.